Good evening, and thanks to the Market Linkage Association for inviting me to speak tonight. Really sorry I can't be there in person. I'm recording this from Timor-Leste, where I've been working for the last year or so. By way of background, I was born in Zimbabwe, grew up on a farm outside of Gweru. We lost our farm in the early 2000s, and shortly after that moved to Australia. So that's where I finished my high school and went to university. It was back in early 2021, at the height of COVID, that I moved back to Zim, moved to Bridge to take on quite an audacious project. I guess there were two things that drove me to return, and these things still drive me today. And the first is a recognition that climate change is hitting our communal farmers the hardest. It's these farmers who haven't contributed to climate change, but they're feeling the impacts first and worst. And they also don't necessarily have the resources or tools to mitigate and adapt to the impacts of climate change. And the other key driver for me is a recognition that land degradation really sits at the root of rural vulnerability. So as the land degrades, communities become less and less resilient, and therefore the way to increase resilience is to regenerate the land. So in 2021, we set out on this rangelands regeneration project. It was a goal of regenerating about 300,000 hectares of land in Bridge, and that would require working with about 20,000 households. We had a phenomenal team. I think we brought quite a fresh and different approach. And then we drew on solutions that were working in Zimbabwe, other parts of Africa, and around the world. But by the end of year three, we really had to face the hard truth that although we had seen a bunch of success, we weren't going to be realizing the vision that we set out to achieve. There were some pretty significant obstacles we were facing. There were some major social challenges. One example of many being that in that part of Bridge, there's a lot of family living and working in South Africa. So although we were engaging and working well with local community members based in Bridge, we were coming across quite a lot of resistance from the family members that we couldn't engage with because they were in South Africa. And they also had outsized influence because they are sending money back to their families in Bridge. There were some quite significant technical challenges which we encountered. One example being we spent 2 years and several $100,000 developing a soil carbon sequestration project. In the end, we came to the conclusion that it simply wasn't viable. That part of Bridge is about 500% overstocked with sheep, cattle, goats and donkeys. So literally nothing that we could do to improve grazing management and move those animals across the landscape was going to result in regenerating the land and improving the carbon in the soil. And then there were some quite significant political challenges. One example is we set up a livestock business centre where we would essentially hold regular sales. This was really successful. We were turning over about $500,000 a year. It was by far the biggest sale taking place in the district. But then the Bridge RDC decided to monopolise all livestock sales, which just massively undermined everything that we were doing. So falling short, I guess, left me with some really serious questions, and I'm sure some questions that you all have asked and perhaps continue to ask. Things like, why is agriculture in Zimbabwe so difficult? Why is poverty so stubborn? And why does every good idea and good intention seemingly run into a different set of obstacles? So fortunately, it was at the time when I was grappling with these questions and kind of working out what comes next that I won a Nuffield scholarship. Nuffield's this amazing program where you're essentially supported to go and travel the world and then to bring back what you've learned and apply it in your home country. So across 2024, I traveled across Brazil, Kenya, New Zealand, Canada, the United States, Australia. And my topic was the future of farming in Zimbabwe. So I wrote a 10,000 word report I then condensed that into about a 90-minute podcast. And then I guess I'm going to try and condense that further in the next 5 minutes or so. I'm going to share with you a few of the principles that I think are relevant, particularly to those of you who are in the room there tonight. So the first thing, I guess the conclusion I came to is that we can't build our agricultural future without being honest about the past. So our colonial agricultural model, it was built on dispossession, and it ran on cheap labour living in poor living conditions. And then that history continued to run through and inform the independence struggle, and then went into the fast-track land reform program. And I really believe we can't just push that aside. And I think the critical lesson we need to take from it is that we mustn't seek to recreate the farming models of the past. And actually, whatever we build has to be equitable, just, and sustainable. So the solutions that we're developing, they need to be technically viable, and they also need to be politically feasible. The second big thing that I came away with was the impacts of climate change, and that we need to face up to them. So in every country that I visited, there was no debate about climate change, whether it was real. Everybody was talking about the impacts that climate change was having and how they were adapting. So in New Zealand and Brazil, there had just been mass flooding. There had been polar vortexes coming through Canada. In some cases, growing regions were entirely disappearing. And in others, there were actually opportunities emerging because places were warming up. They could grow products that weren't previously viable. I guess for me then the question became, well, what does this mean for Zimbabwe? How can we build resilience to climate change, recognizing the impacts that we are currently seeing? And for me, I think this comes down to three things: irrigation, genetics, and farming practices. And I'm going to jump into them quickly. So for irrigation, I think the irrigation infrastructure being developed, or that has been developed in Zimbabwe, is genuinely impressive. But now the challenge rests in how do we use that well, and how do we keep it operating in a sustainable way. In Bridge, and I think it's probably a story that many of you have seen or come across, we worked with 5 irrigation schemes. Of those irrigation schemes, not one of them was operating at its full potential. All of them required upgrades to infrastructure, and they were essentially waiting for the next development partner or for government to come and help them with infrastructural upgrades. So the question is, how do we effectively utilize irrigation infrastructure? And I see so much promise in commercial community partnerships or private community partnerships. Essentially, the private sector's got a lot to offer in terms of growing practices, bringing in new technologies, access to markets. I think the key challenge becomes, how do we have necessary safeguards in place where communities aren't being dispossessed from their land resource, but how can they work together with a private partner? And there's a lot of promise there that I think needs to be explored and scaled up. The second key thing that I came across is genetics and the huge role that improved genetics can play. So in Kenya and Tanzania right now, there's a really stark example. So both countries crop about 1 million hectares of dry beans annually. However, Tanzania has about double the yield. So these are countries with pretty similar soils and climates. I wouldn't say that the Tanzanian farmers are necessarily any better. What it simply comes down to is the varieties that they are growing. Now, I'm no expert on the various types of varieties and breeds happening in Zimbabwe. What I saw around the world is that there's huge investment going into new varieties and breeds, and that's where a lot of the growth and the profitability can come from. So my question is, what could we potentially be missing out on in Zimbabwe right now? And how can we be investing in the right areas? I think there's potentially also another question to be asked around the GMO discussion. And I realize it's a really complex discussion, it's highly nuanced, but a lot of the global agricultural powerhouses have achieved what they've achieved through GMOs. And is it potentially time for Zimbabwe to reevaluate its stance on GMOs? The final point I wanted to make, I guess, particularly with reference to climate change and building resilience, is adopting farming practices that promote soil conservation. The reality that I saw around the world is that conservation farming is actually the norm. Conservation is not something that's being imposed on farmers, but they're actually doing it because it makes good business sense. So across Brazil and America, you have these massive corn and soybean producers who are cropping literal millions of hectares. They've been doing no-till for the past 30 years. They're reducing their chemical use and they're moving to biologicals, and they're also planting cover crops to restore nutrients into the soil. This is because it makes business sense. So, how do we relate this to Zimbabwe? So in Zim, Fumbudza is a clear success. But I guess my question is, how can we scale that up, and how can we promote soil conservation across all of our farmer groups? I guess the final point I wanted to make is that we need to recognize that our different farmer groups need different types of support. So we have our communal farmers, and I think it's fair to say that for the average communal farmer in Zimbabwe, which is the majority of our farmers, their daily focus is survival. And the question therefore becomes, well, how do we move these farmers from survival to stability? And that's going to be a combination of things that I've spoken about. It's how do we improve the farming practices? How do we maybe get them better seeds or genetics? How do we better utilize irrigation infrastructure? How can we access better markets? We then have our small-scale farmers. These are the farmers who are operating largely in the informal section. They're commercially farming, but they're selling to informal markets. They are highly vulnerable. So again, how do we create more resilience here? One example that I saw in Kenya was these large exporters who are working with small-scale commercial farmers and communal farmers. They were helping them to improve quality and consistency, and then they were sending that product to international markets all over the world. I know that's happening in pockets in Zimbabwe, but I guess it's a question of how can we scale that up so that becomes more of the norm in the country. Then I think we have the commercial farmers, and the critical point here, I think, is recognizing the importance of commercial farmers in the agricultural sector in Zimbabwe. So they obviously generate foreign currency for the country. They create a bunch of jobs, but they're also a major driver of innovation. They bring in innovations which then cascade to the other farming groups in the country. So we've got to recognize, let's support these farmers in different ways, but then at the same time, there's a lot of potential for these farmer groups to work together. So how can the large-scale commercial farmers bring in the small-scale communal farmers into their value chains, because that makes commercial sense? They're not doing it because it's of their corporate social responsibility or their social license. They're doing it because it makes good business sense. We're starting to see that happen in parts of the country, and I guess it's a question of how do we work with more of these farmers, more of these groups, to bring them together and to scale that up. I think I'm going to pause there. Just wanted to say, thank you so much. I hope that something that I've shared tonight resonates. I hope it stimulates some discussion. I'm sorry I can't be there with you all, but I look forward to connecting in due course. And please feel free to reach out in the meantime. Thank you.